not what you're trying to go after. You're just trying to stop brown people from coming in. And
hello there. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Vaush. Vaush is a neckbeard, man-child video game streamer who has some of the worst takes on politics on YouTube. He likes to live stream with people who are weak debaters, and during these live streams, he enjoys the advantage of being able to make shit up on the spot. So let's hear what this neck-bearded expert has to say about the US-Mexican border.
So if your goal is to keep any number of Mexicans or Latin Americans out of this country at any expense using any methods, then yes, it is a truth that building that wall would probably help. But if you have other goals, like, for example, a sane, sensible immigration policy, the very concept of ethics, or maintaining a healthy economy in our own country, then no, building a wall is not a truth.
So this would be a good time to have a conversation about ethics. Not everyone agrees on what is ethical and what isn't. In fact, this is an entire branch of philosophy. Depending on what philosopher you talk to, there's different ways of determining what's ethical and what's unethical. I believe that it is the system of ethics that makes the most sense. And in fact, I consider alternative views of ethics, such as utilitarianism or deontology, to be basically barbarian version of ethics. But let's avoid this philosophical debate and focus on common ground. No matter what ethical system you personally adhere to, I think that everyone would agree that human suffering and human death is bad, that they are things that we should seek to avoid. I think most people would agree that corporate profits that were gained through the deaths of millions of people through immense human suffering would not be worthwhile. We would rather avoid the deaths and the suffering than experience the bounty of corporate profits that resulted in the alternative. This brings me to the US-Mexican border situation. Well, we know that 94% of the drugs consumed in the United States come from Mexico. That includes heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine. And every year, tens of thousands of people die from overdoses of these drugs, which would not have ever entered the United States if they had not come across the US-Mexican border. We also know that the United States has one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world, that our country is extremely violent with high rates of armed robberies, home invasions, and murders, and most of those are related to drugs. A lot of the murders that happen in the United States are committed for the purposes of stealing someone's drugs or stealing money that was made from selling drugs. We also know that Mexico and Central America are also extremely violent countries. Mexico's entire government has been compromised by drug cartels, gang violence is widespread, the rate of impunity for committing violent crimes is astronomical. Only 3% of murders in Mexico successfully result in a conviction. Journalists are regularly killed in that country. And news story after news story documents the discovery of mass graves of women and children. All of this violence is related to the smuggling of drugs across the US-Mexican border. If you take all of these deaths in Mexico, deaths in Central America, murders that happen in the United States, drug overdoses that happen in the United States, and you add them up, you end up with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths every year. And when you consider the fact that this problem has been ongoing for the last 50, 60 years, when you add all of that up, you're looking at the deaths of millions of people. Now, people like Vaush, who defend the status quo at the US-Mexican border, do so out of purely ideological reasons. They believe in liberalism and will defend liberalist policies even if those policies result in the deaths of millions upon millions of people. In this way, Vaush is very similar to the Soviet Union era communist who defended Joseph Stalin.
During what many historians term Stalin's reign of terror, no one was safe from his ambition. His forced industrialization led to countless millions of deaths, and the worst man-made famine in human history.
Joseph Stalin instituted policies of industrialization and collective farming that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. These policies were ideologically driven. Stalin wanted the Soviet Union to pursue communism, even though the results of communism were the deaths of millions of people. But that didn't matter to Stalin or his supporters. What mattered was that the Soviet Union followed a policy that strictly adhered to the ideology of communism. It's for this reason that I would describe Vaush as a stooge for globalist capitalism. At the end of the day, he's willing to defend policies that are ideologically driven, that result in the deaths of millions of people and cause mass human suffering, because he is in favor of more profits to globalist corporations, because that's ultimately what the open borders delivers to us. That is what we get in exchange for the deaths of all of these people.
Right now, there's nothing, and they can just migrate in mass. A barrier is going to allow us to stop the mass of people coming, and it's going to cut back on sex trafficking that's happening. There's an open air slave market down on the southern border. It's crazy. And so my heart bleeds for those women that go to those unknown faiths. I mean, genuinely, my heart truly.
Yeah, we don't need to virtue signal or anything. It's okay. Listen. Are you white?
Yeah.
Okay, listen.
I don't.
We don't have to pretend here. We both hate brown people. Come on, it's okay. White to white, we can.
Notice how the conservative person is trying to have an honest, heartfelt debate, while Vaush is being entirely condescending and nasty. This is very typical of how a conversation between a right-wing conservative and a leftist like Vaush would typically play out. During this debate, Vaush repeatedly talks about what's ethical and moral to do. If he's not going to even treat people he's talking to with basic levels of respect, if he's going to treat people unkindly, then I don't see why we would listen to a single thing that he has to say about what's ethical or moral to do.
So you say you want to keep the masses out, but then you mention people that represent a statistical minority of the people coming into this country from the southern border. You mentioned drug trafficking and sex trade. Now, these are very serious problems. I agree with that, but I don't really think they constitute the mass of.
So there you have it, folks. Vaush is willing to tolerate some human slavery, some sex trafficking, so long as a majority of the people who are illegally crossing the US-Mexican border are not engaged in these sort of activities. So this is a pretty standard belief that left-wing people like Vaush have, that human slavery is acceptable as long as it's in small numbers, that sex trafficking is an acceptable thing to occur in our society, so long as the majority of people aren't engaging in it.
People coming. The mass of the people coming seem to be ordinary people from Latin America trying to find a better life, or refugees, or asylum seekers.
I would say the fact that 80% of asylum claims made by Central American migrants are denied would be indicative that, in fact, most of the people crossing over the US-Mexican border are in fact looking to commit fraud. I think a more accurate description of them would be criminals. It is, after all, a crime to lie under oath or lie on immigration paperwork.
You see, the mass of people coming up from the border are people with no money and no time, no power. The people who are sex trafficking and bringing drugs up are the exact kinds of people who would have the money and positions of influence to send people in through ports of entry.
This is precisely the reason that, in addition to building the wall, we need to close down the ports of entry. All this human suffering, the deaths of millions of people, it needs to be brought to an end. And if corporations lose out on profits because of that, that's a sacrifice that most people would be eager and willing to make. Unless, of course, you are a stooge for globalist companies.
The ones doing the drugs and sex trafficking are more than capable of getting things across the border without the wall. like 100%.
Right now, drugs are smuggled over the United States in two different ways. They are either smuggled through the ports of entry or they are backpacked into the United States through the desert. The same thing is true of human trafficking. Humans are trafficked through the ports of entry or they are trafficked through the open desert. It is true that building a wall only shuts down the smuggling that occurs through the desert. It's still possible that people or drugs could be trafficked through the ports of entry, which is why I just stated that the ports of entry should be closed as well. But even if the federal government only pursued one of these things, if it just built the wall and didn't close the ports of entry, it would still close down an avenue in which drugs and sex slaves are trafficked. It would reduce the options and the ability of the drug cartel to smuggle drugs across the US-Mexican border. Now, I want this problem solved entirely, not partially, but a wall just by itself would be progress towards what we need to do.
Dude, the easiest way to deal with both of those would be to A, end the drug war so we can grow and sell drugs domestically in an open market rather than getting it from drug cartels in the South. And B, to get rid of sex trafficking would be to make these people citizens and not make them fear for their lives. The reason why sex trafficking is such an issue, because if you're brought in illegally and you go to the police to report a rape or that you've been kidnapped, you then get fucking recommended to ICE and deported.
We'll talk about legalizing drugs in a second here, but I want to focus on the dishonest claims made by Vaush that victims of crime, if they go to police and report those crimes, are going to be referred to ICE and deported from the country. That is simply untrue. That is not how law enforcement works. Victims who report crimes to police are not referred to ICE for deportation. And in fact, the thing that Vaush advocates for, that we should give citizenship to victims of crime so that they'll cooperate with law enforcement in prosecuting the people who commit these crimes, that actually already exists in the United States. There is a special visa called the U visa, which is available to victims of crime. The reason this visa exists is for the purpose of securing the cooperation of victims of horrible crimes like sex trafficking, and to make sure that they will be available to testify as witnesses in prosecutions for this type of crime. So the thing that Vaush is advocating for, the policy he says the United States needs, is in fact the current policy of the United States. Now that I've said that, let's go back to the earlier statement that Vaush said, that we simply need to legalize all the drugs in order to solve this problem. Well, there are parts of this country that you can go to where drugs are essentially legalized, where it is legal to both possess drugs and to sell drugs. Now, in these areas, there are still limits on how much drugs that a drug dealer can have on them, but the limits are well known. And as long as you know what you're doing, you can effectively use or sell drugs with impunity in these parts of the United States. And the parts I'm talking about are California, Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, amongst others. The results of these policies have been massive social problems. If you visit these areas, you will see that a lot of people live in tents on the sidewalk. Human feces is a major problem and struggle for these areas. In a recent news story, a scientist from the city of Los Angeles indicated that its streets were dirtier than those of the slums in Mumbai, India. In fact, a bubonic plague epidemic is imminent to occur in the city of Los Angeles due to the disgusting conditions of that city. A city prosecutor who works in downtown Los Angeles recently contracted the disease typhus, which is a disease that was pretty much unknown in modern times. It's a disease that was not really commonplace since medieval times. If you visit these cities, you will see large numbers of transient people wandering the streets, just muttering to themselves like zombies. These are not flourishing human beings. They're people who are basically zombies, who are slaves to their addiction. No one wants to be trapped in a situation where they're forced to slowly kill themselves while living a miserable existence inside of a tent on a sidewalk. Yet that is the reality in cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and Portland, Oregon. These are the same people that end up overdosing on drugs and end up dead. The same people who Vaush is willing to sacrifice to increase the profits of globalist corporations who depend on the open borders between US and Mexico. If you don't want to live in a disease-filled shithole where people shit on the sidewalk before slowly killing themselves with drugs, then legalizing drugs in the United States is not an option for you. A better option would be shutting down the US-Mexican border, preventing 94% of the drugs that are consumed in the United States from getting into the hands of drug addicts. That is the more humane and more sensible option. It's a simple matter of people over profits.
No, what I care about is these women going to unknown fates. That's the main thing.
Okay, good. Then legalize all of these citizens, make it so they don't fear the police, so they
that
can
will
come forward
do
and report
nothing.
crimes.
That will do nothing.
No,
Nothing.
What you're saying right now, you're posting cringe, my friend. That would absolutely do something.
Again and again in this debate, Vaush proves himself to be extremely ignorant on the issue of sex trafficking. Anyone with experience with sex trafficking will tell you that victims are extremely reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement or to report that they're being trafficked. Sex trafficking victims are manipulated by the men who traffic them. Pimps or other individuals who traffic women will threaten them, threaten their family members, tell them lies about their situation. Traffickers will also pretend to love or care for the victims who they traffic. All of this manipulation makes victims of sex trafficking extremely reluctant to go and talk to law enforcement. So simply providing some sort of provision to give citizenship to sex trafficking victims will not solve the problem. And we know that because, in fact, we already have U visas. Sex trafficking victims are already eligible to become U.S. citizens if they report sex trafficking to law enforcement. But the fact of the matter is that they still don't. It's still law enforcement that has to go out there and uncover these sex trafficking rings. That's why Vaush has no idea what he's talking about.
There have been many studies indicating that a ton of crime goes on in the illegal immigrant community, with them being taken advantage of by the people who brought them there because they know that they can't go to the police. You were 100% wrong on this.
No, this would not do anything at all to reduce sex trafficking across the US-Mexican border. It's already the case that people who report being victims of crime are not referred to ICE for deportation. And Vaush, he would not be able to present you with a single example that this is the status quo in the United States. There's also already a visa available for victims of crime called a U visa that they can apply for if they want to. Yet once again, sex trafficking rings, human slavery is commonplace in the United States, despite these provisions being available for illegal immigrant victims.
Slaves. We're talking about sex slaves.
Do you not think that allowing people who are involved in that industry to go to the police might have an impact there? What about opening people with open arms at the border so we can just take them in and not have them flee across to sanctuary cities or to cities on the southern border where they know they might have camaraderie they can establish enclaves in? What if they were just welcomed as American citizens?
Again, Vaush has no idea what he's talking about here. If we were to completely open the US-Mexican border, if we offered citizenship to anyone who crossed that border, who wanted it, it would be a giant invitation to human smugglers to bring in slaves and women, children, and men to be sex trafficked in the United States. The reason for this is that in third world countries, there is impunity to commit crimes. That means it is very easy for slavers or sex traffickers to enslave people and exploit them in order to make money. That is why scumbag American tourists will often go to third world countries to engage in as much prostitution, and sometimes including child prostitution, as they want. Of course, if these sex traffickers and slavers could bring their slaves into the United States and sell them to Americans, they could expect to make a lot more money than they can in the third world shitholes that they currently live in. What Vaush is proposing here would be a human rights disaster on a grand scale.
Why? Then they'd just be legal American citizens being sex trafficked.
No, because being a legal American citizen affords you opportunities within this country that would allow you to more effectively take advantage of the justice system, which prevents sex trafficking.
Again, this is not how sex trafficking works. Sex trafficking victims are not put in a position where they feel that they are able to go to law enforcement in order to report some crimes been committed against them. And it's not solely for immigration reasons. Sex traffickers will threaten people's family. They'll threaten to kill the victim. They will literally imprison them in a room with a lock on it that they cannot leave. These are the realities of the tens of thousands of people who are literally human slaves in the United States. Providing U.S. citizenship to these people, which, by the way, the federal government already does through the U visa program, will not solve this problem. And we know it won't solve this problem because Americans are routinely sex trafficked. These are people who were born in the United States who are unquestionably citizens. But despite their citizenship, they still end up trafficked. The reason is that sex traffickers can deter people from working with law enforcement. It doesn't need the fact that the person is an illegal immigrant in order to do this.
Really studied criminology in college. If you want to come at me from a you don't know what you're talking about perspective, you better find another YouTuber. What I'm saying right now is factually correct.
Not sure
Well, for someone who studied criminology, you seem to have no idea what you're talking about, Vaush. You say that the solution to sex trafficking across the US-Mexican border is to provide citizenship to victims, and then those victims will come forward and report the crimes against them. But you seem to have no idea that this is the current policy of the United States, that the U visa is a thing that exists where victims are given a visa that allows them to stay in the country permanently in order to testify against some criminal who trafficked them. The fact that you seem to have no idea that this visa even exists strongly suggests that you are not qualified to be having this discussion.
I just don't. Do you understand that these people are slaves? Like they don't have any. They're not going to be able to go to the police anyway.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I totally understand what you're getting at. But if you imagine right now, like just fathom it for a moment, okay?
This is absolutely hilarious. This guy is pointing out to Vaush that there are slaves in America, and Vaush literally just doesn't give a shit. He's so committed to being a stooge for globalist capitalism that he just doesn't care that there are people who are slaves in the United States this very day.
Shit like that. Like, yeah, they still have institutional issues to deal with, but an ability to engage with the government without fear of deportation is a massive step one to dealing with sex trafficking.
Again, Vaush lies about what happens to illegal immigrants in the United States when they report that they're the victims of crime. There's not a single police department in the entire United States that, upon receiving a complaint that a crime has been committed, will then go and arrest the victim of the crime and send them off to ICE to be deported. That's not how it works in this country. This does not occur even in the most red of red states. Every time Vaush brings this up in this debate, he is either being dishonest or he has no idea what he is talking about.
Building a wall isn't going to help, but exposing these people to the society they live within would go a huge way towards giving them the legitimacy and the mobility necessary to begin to take apart illegal institutions operating within this country. After all, whistleblowers and rats and narcs are really, really important methods for the police to take down illegal organizations.
Just moments earlier, Vaush was arguing that we just need to provide immunity or citizenship to victims of sex trafficking and that they would then come forward and report their accusers. But what Vaush just said right here is that the federal government would have to rely on rats, whistleblowers, and narcs in order to prosecute these offenders. This is obviously inconsistent with what he has been arguing the entire time. If law enforcement needs to proactively go out and discover these sex trafficking rings, if they need to get people from within the organization to defect and work with them in an undercover capacity as confidential informants, then that means simply offering immunity or citizenship or a U visa to victims of crime will not be adequate at stopping this problem. And if that's the case, then yes, we should consider building a wall and shutting down the ports of entry as a way to prevent all of these people from being trafficked into the interior of the United States.
Those people
They're
aren't gonna
also
go to the
unheard
police.
of in these communities. They're unheard
Because
of. Do you know
they'll
the
get
risk of-
deported. They will literally get
No,
deported.
because
if they-
they'll-
Okay, I can't do any more of this. This stream goes on for another 2 hours, and it's only been about 10 minutes, and already Vaush just keeps lying and lying. He keeps claiming that law enforcement will deport victims of crime merely for reporting the fact that they've been a victim of a crime. This is a lie. It's not true. Nowhere in the United States are crime victims arrested and referred to ICE for deportation. That doesn't happen in this country. The other thing Vaush keeps repeating again and again during this debate is that we simply need to give victims of crime some sort of immunity or citizenship, and that will solve the problem of sex trafficking across the US-Mexican border. This is again not true. The federal government already has a U visa, which allows victims of crimes such as sex trafficking to remain in the country. We already have that as part of the policy of the United States. And the fact that sex trafficking is still a massive problem across the US-Mexican border means that a policy like that Vaush is proposing during this debate would be ineffective at solving the problem. If Vaush is just going to repeat these two lies over and over again, as he has done so for the last 10 minutes of this debate, then there's really no point in me continuing watching it. But I'll leave it up to you. If you think that I should watch more of this debate or some of his other debates and respond to it, then let me know. Otherwise though, I'm done for today. If you like this video and you're not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and subscribe.
I'm doing pretty wonderfully. Just having a nice night. We're talking about our Five Nights at Freddy's fanfics. You know how it be.